The Chevrolet Biscayne XP37 doesn't just look like the future, it looks like a version of the future that never quite found a place to exist. Because unlike production cars, which are shaped by compromise, cost, and practicality, this concept was free from all of that. Built by General Motors during a period when optimism about technology was at its peak, the Biscayne wasn't trying to solve everyday transportation problems. It was trying to imagine what transportation could become. And when you remove limits like that, design stops being cautious, it becomes speculative. At first glance, the Chevrolet Biscayne XP37 feels almost unreal. The proportions are sleek, the surfaces are clean, and the overall form suggests motion even when the car is completely still. But what truly defines it is not just the shape, it's the openness. The wraparound windshield doesn't simply extend visibility, it transforms the entire experience of being inside the car. Instead of looking through a defined front frame, the driver is surrounded by glass, with minimal interruption between interior and exterior. It feels less like sitting in a vehicle, and more like being placed inside a transparent shell. That idea continues throughout the design. The cabin isn't treated as a separate, enclosed space. It's integrated into the overall form, visually and conceptually. The boundaries between inside and outside become almost blurred, almost intentionally weakened. One observer at the time described it in a way that still feels accurate. It's not a car interior, it's a viewing platform. That's the key shift. Because traditional cars create separation, they protect, isolate, and define clear limits between the occupant and the environment. The Biscayne challenges that idea. It invites the outside world in. And that invitation changes how the entire vehicle feels. The interior reflects this philosophy just as strongly. Instead of a cluttered dashboard filled with mechanical controls, the design leans towards simplicity and futurism. Surfaces are clean, elements are integrated, and the layout suggests a kind of intuitive interaction that was far ahead of its time. It doesn't feel mechanical, it feels conceptual, almost like a prototype for a different kind of human-machine relationship. And that's where the deeper strangeness begins. Because while the Chevrolet Biscayne XP37 looks advanced, it doesn't necessarily align with how cars ultimately evolved. It represents a vision where transparency, openness, and minimal separation were central ideas. But the real future took a different path. Safety requirements increased, structural rigidity became more important, complex systems replaced simplicity. The transparent, open feeling that the Biscayne emphasized became harder to maintain in practical vehicles. So the concept remained exactly that, a concept, a possibility rather than a direction. One historian later summarized its place in automotive history like this: "It showed a future, but not the one we chose." And that's what makes it so fascinating. Because unlike some concept cars that directly influence production models, the Chevrolet Biscayne XP37 represents an alternate timeline, a vision where cars became lighter in appearance, more transparent, more integrated with their surroundings. A future where driving felt less enclosed, less separated, more exposed to the world outside. And that future never fully arrived. Even visually, the car carries that sense of possibility without resolution. The lines are clean but not aggressive. The form is advanced but not extreme. It feels like a direction waiting to be developed further, one step in a path that was never fully taken. That incompleteness gives it a unique kind of presence. It's not a finished idea, it's a question. One owner of a similar era concept once said, "You don't look at it and think that's a car, you think that's what cars might become." What makes it insane? A vision of the future that never fully arrived. But the deeper reality goes further. The Chevrolet Biscayne XP37 reveals how uncertain the future of design really is, even when it seems obvious at the time. It shows that not all innovation leads to adoption. It demonstrates that some ideas are explored, understood, and then quietly left behind. It captures a moment when imagination moved faster than practicality and didn't look back. And that's why it still feels so compelling today.
not because it predicted the future, but because it imagined one we never got to experience. A car that doesn't represent what became real, but what almost did.
The Goggomobil Dart feels like someone took the entire idea of a sports car, speed, agility, driver involvement, and stripped it down so aggressively that only the barest essentials survived. And what's left doesn't just look minimal, it looks almost unreal. Built by buckle motors using components from glass, the original Goggomobil, the Dart wasn't trying to compete with traditional sports cars. It didn't have the power, the size, or the engineering complexity to do that. So instead of scaling up, it scaled down, radically. At first glance, the Goggomobil Dart doesn't even register as a proper car. The proportions are so small, so tight, that it feels closer to a machine designed for play rather than transportation. The body is low and narrow, the stance compact to the point of absurdity, and the overall presence almost disappears compared to full-sized vehicles. It looks like a toy. But that impression is misleading, because underneath that tiny, almost playful exterior is a very deliberate philosophy: performance through reduction. Instead of adding horsepower, the Dart removes weight. Instead of increasing complexity, it simplifies everything. Instead of isolating the driver, it connects them directly to the machine. And that changes the experience completely. Driving it doesn't feel like operating a conventional car. There's no sense of mass, no buffer between you and the road. Every input, steering, throttle, braking, translates immediately into motion. There's no delay, no filtering, just direct response. One owner described it in a way that captures that rawness perfectly. It's not driving, it's reacting. That reaction-based feeling comes from how little there is between you and the mechanics. The car is so light that even modest power becomes meaningful. Acceleration isn't about force, it's about immediacy. Cornering isn't about grip alone, it's about balance and momentum. And because the car is so small, everything feels amplified. A slight steering input feels sharp. A small increase in speed feels dramatic. A simple maneuver feels engaging. It's not objectively fast in the way larger sports cars are, but it feels fast. And that distinction is everything. Because the Goggomobil Dart doesn't chase speed as a number, it chases sensation. It creates the feeling of performance without relying on traditional performance metrics. That's what makes it so unusual. Because most sports cars of the era were defined by power, displacement, and size. Bigger engines, heavier bodies, more substantial construction. The Dart goes in the complete opposite direction. Smaller engine, lighter body, less structure. And yet, it still delivers something that feels unmistakably like a sports car experience, just in a completely different form. Even visually, that philosophy is obvious. There's no excess, no unnecessary ornamentation. The body is simple, almost bare, with just enough shape to define it as a vehicle. It doesn't try to look powerful or imposing. It looks efficient, purpose-built, almost temporary. One observer once said, "It looks like it was built just to move and nothing else." That's not far from the truth, because the Goggomobil Dart removes everything that isn't essential to the act of driving. Comfort is minimal, protection is limited, presence is almost non-existent. What remains is motion, pure, immediate, unfiltered motion. And that purity is both its strength and its strangeness. Because while it delivers a genuine driving experience, it does so in a way that feels completely disconnected from what most people expect a sports car to be. It's not dramatic, it's not powerful, it's not imposing. It's small, simple, and almost fragile. Yet somehow it still works. One longtime owner summed it up in a way that feels almost paradoxical. It's half a car, but all the fun. What makes it insane, sports car concept reduced to its absolute minimum. But the deeper reality goes further. The Goggomobil Dart challenges the assumption that performance requires scale. It shows that speed can be felt, not just measured. It demonstrates that engagement comes from connection, not complexity.
It proves that reducing a machine sometimes reveals its essence more clearly than expanding it. And that's why it remains so fascinating. Not because it redefines what a sports car is, but because it asks a more uncomfortable question. How much of a sports car do you actually need before it stops being one?
The Subaru 360 feels like it came from a completely different idea of what a car should be. So different, in fact, that when it appeared alongside the larger, heavier machines of its time, it didn't just look small, it looked out of place. Built by Subaru in a period when Japan was rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, the 360 wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to function under strict limitations. Materials were scarce, roads were narrow, fuel efficiency mattered more than performance, and affordability was essential. So instead of scaling up like many Western manufacturers were doing, Subaru scaled everything down, radically. The result is a car that doesn't just appear compact, it feels almost compressed, as if the entire concept of a vehicle has been condensed into the smallest possible footprint that still qualifies as transportation. At first glance, the Subaru 360 looks almost playful. The rounded shape, the small wheels, the minimal dimensions, it resembles something closer to a toy than a machine built for real-world use. But that impression quickly becomes more complicated, because once you see it next to other cars of its era, large American sedans, wide European saloons, the contrast becomes almost surreal. It doesn't just look small, it looks like it belongs to a different category entirely. One owner described that feeling in a way that captures it perfectly. It felt like driving something that could disappear in traffic. That sense of vulnerability is part of the experience, because the 360 doesn't project presence, it doesn't dominate space. It occupies it lightly, almost cautiously, as if aware that everything around it is larger, heavier, and more powerful. And that awareness changes how the car feels. Driving it isn't about commanding the road, it's about navigating it. The engine, small and modest, reflects the same philosophy. It isn't built for speed or performance, it's built for efficiency, simplicity, and reliability within tight constraints. Acceleration is gentle, top speed is limited. Everything about the drivetrain emphasizes conservation rather than excess. And yet, within those limits, the car works, not as a compromise, but as a solution. Because in the environment it was designed for, dense cities, short distances, limited resources, the Subaru 360 makes perfect sense. Its size becomes an advantage. Its lightness becomes efficiency. Its simplicity becomes practicality. But when that same car enters a different context, especially markets like the United States where size and power were dominant values, the logic breaks down. What feels efficient in one place feels inadequate in another. What feels clever in one environment feels fragile in another. And that's where the strangeness becomes most apparent. Because the 360 doesn't fail on its own terms, it clashes with the expectations of the world around it. One critic from the time famously described it in blunt terms, reflecting how poorly it was received in certain markets. It's not built for our roads, it's built for somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else is important, because the Subaru 360 isn't trying to compete with larger cars, it's redefining what a car can be when size is no longer the priority. And that redefinition feels almost extreme when viewed through the lens of a decade obsessed with expansion. The 1950s and 1960s, particularly in America, were defined by growth. Longer cars, wider bodies, more power, more presence. Bigger wasn't just better, it was expected. The Subaru 360 rejects that entirely. Smaller, lighter, simpler. It moves in the opposite direction, and that makes it feel almost like a contradiction on wheels. Visually, the design reinforces this idea. The rounded, bubble-like shape isn't aggressive or imposing. It's soft, contained, almost self-effacing. It doesn't demand attention, it avoids it. Which is unusual for a car. Most vehicles are designed to assert themselves in some way, through size, shape, or presence.
The Subaru 360 does the opposite. It minimizes itself. One observer once said, "It looks like it's trying not to take up space." And that's exactly what it does. What makes it insane? Extreme smallness in a decade obsessed with size. But the deeper reality goes further. The Subaru 360 isn't just small, it represents a completely different philosophy of mobility. It shows that efficiency can replace excess. It demonstrates that usefulness doesn't require scale. It proves that a car doesn't have to dominate its environment to function within it. And that's why it still feels so unusual today. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that contradicted the dominant values of its time. A car that doesn't try to be bigger, faster, or stronger, but instead asks a quieter question: how little can a car be and still be enough?
The Cadillac Cyclone doesn't just feel futuristic. It feels like it skipped several decades of development and arrived fully formed from a version of the future that didn't yet exist. Because while most concept cars of the 1950s were focused on styling, tail fins, chrome, exaggerated proportions, the Cyclone went somewhere much stranger. It imagined intelligence. Built by General Motors under the direction of visionary designer Harley Earl, the Cyclone wasn't just about how a car looked, it was about how a car might think, react, and protect its occupants long before those ideas became realistic. And that's where it crosses from futuristic into almost surreal. At first glance, the Cadillac Cyclone looks like a product of the jet age taken to its extreme. The body is sharp, angular, and dramatic, with a presence that feels more like a missile than a traditional automobile. The nose is pointed, the surfaces are taut, and the entire form suggests motion, speed, and purpose. But then you notice the canopy. Instead of a conventional roof, the Cyclone uses a clear, bubble-like dome, more aircraft than automobile. It doesn't just cover the cabin, it transforms it into something closer to a cockpit. Visibility becomes panoramic, almost total, removing the sense of enclosure that defines most cars. It feels exposed, but also advanced, like you're inside a machine designed to move through a different environment. One observer described it perfectly. It doesn't feel like you sit in it, you feel like you're sealed inside it. That sense of being enclosed in a transparent shell adds to the otherworldly presence. It doesn't follow automotive tradition, it borrows from aviation, space exploration, and pure imagination. But the real shock isn't the shape, it's what's hidden inside. The Cadillac Cyclone featured an early form of radar-based collision detection. Sensors were placed in the front of the vehicle, integrated into those distinctive nose cones, and were designed to detect objects ahead of the vehicle, not just visually, electronically. If something was detected, the system could warn the driver and, in theory, even influence the vehicle's behavior. In the 1950s, at a time when most cars didn't even have basic safety features like seatbelts as standard equipment, the idea of a car actively sensing its environment and helping prevent accidents was almost unimaginable. It wasn't just ahead of its time, it belonged to a different era entirely. One engineer later reflected on the concept with a mix of admiration and disbelief. They were thinking about collision avoidance before most people were thinking about collision survival. That distinction matters because for decades, automotive safety focused on what happens after a crash: stronger structures, better restraints, improved protection. The Cyclone was thinking about preventing the crash altogether. And that idea wouldn't become widely practical until many decades later, with modern sensors, computers, and electronic systems finally making it feasible. So in a way, the Cadillac Cyclone wasn't just predicting the future, it was predicting a very specific part of it. A future where cars are aware of their surroundings, a future where machines assist human judgment, a future where safety is proactive, not reactive. And yet, despite that forward-thinking vision, the car itself was never meant to be practical.
The canopy, for example, required a separate sealed environment. It even had provisions for climate control and protection from external conditions. The styling was too extreme for production. The technology was far beyond what could be realistically implemented at the time. It was a concept in the purest sense, a demonstration, a question posed in physical form. What if cars could do this? And for a long time, the answer was simply, they couldn't. Not yet. One historian summarized the Cadillac Cyclone's place in history in a way that feels almost poetic. It showed a future that had to wait for technology to catch up. That waiting is what makes the Cadillac Cyclone so fascinating today, because unlike many concept cars that influence design trends immediately, the Cyclone planted ideas that would only become real decades later. Adaptive cruise control, collision warning systems, autonomous sensing. All of those concepts exist now, but in 1959, they felt almost impossible. What makes it insane? Early electronic safety systems decades before they became real. But the deeper reality goes further. The Cadillac Cyclone shows what happens when imagination outruns capability. It proves that innovation can exist long before it can be implemented. It demonstrates that the future is often visible in fragments scattered across ideas that don't yet connect. It reveals that sometimes the most important concepts aren't the ones that get built, but the ones that get imagined early enough to shape what comes later. And that's why it still feels so unreal. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right far too soon. A car that didn't just predict the future, but arrived there before anyone else was ready.
The Messerschmitt KR200 feels less like a car that borrowed ideas from aviation, and more like an aircraft that was forced to adapt to the road. That distinction matters, because unlike many post-war vehicles that simply adopted aerodynamic styling cues, this machine came directly from an aviation mindset. Built by Messerschmitt, a company whose identity was rooted in fighter planes, the KR200 wasn't trying to reinterpret the car. It was trying to reinterpret mobility itself, using the only design language it truly understood. And that language wasn't automotive. It was aeronautical. The first thing that defines the Messerschmitt KR200 is the canopy. Not a roof in the conventional sense, but a clear, bubble-like enclosure that lifts upward, exposing the entire cockpit in one motion. It doesn't open like a door. It opens like access to a machine. You don't step into it, you climb in. That alone changes the experience completely. The act of entering the vehicle feels deliberate, almost procedural, like preparing for operation rather than casual use. And once inside, the difference becomes even more pronounced. The seating is arranged in tandem, driver in front, passenger directly behind, just like in a trainer aircraft or fighter cockpit. There is no side-by-side interaction, no shared horizontal space. Everything is aligned along a central axis, reinforcing the sense that this is not a social environment, it's a controlled one. One owner described it in a way that captures it perfectly. It doesn't feel like you're going somewhere together, it feels like you're taking someone along for the ride. That subtle shift reflects the car's entire philosophy, because the Messerschmitt KR200 isn't designed around comfort or convention, it's designed around efficiency, minimalism, and directional control. The narrow body reinforces this idea. It occupies very little space laterally, almost slicing through the road rather than sitting on it. From the outside, that narrowness makes it look fragile, almost too small to be stable. And in some ways, that impression isn't entirely wrong, because while the car is light and efficient, that same lightness can translate to instability if pushed beyond its limits. The balance is delicate. The center of gravity, the narrow track, and the minimal structure all contribute to a driving experience that requires attention. It doesn't tolerate carelessness. One driver once put it bluntly, "It feels fine until it suddenly doesn't." That unpredictability, even if only at the extremes, adds to the sense that you're not just driving, you're managing a machine with very specific limits. And yet, within those limits, the KR200 delivers something unique.
The light weight makes it responsive. The small engine, while modest, doesn't have much mass to move. Acceleration feels immediate relative to its size. Steering inputs translate quickly into direction changes. There's a sense of direct connection that larger, heavier cars often dilute. But unlike a traditional sports car, where that responsiveness is paired with stability and control, here it feels more exposed, more immediate, more dependent on the driver's awareness. That's why people often describe it not just as driving, but as piloting. Because the experience involves more than just input and response. It involves anticipation, balance, and a constant awareness of how the machine behaves within its narrow operating envelope. Even visually, the Messerschmitt KR200 reinforces this identity. It doesn't try to look like a conventional car. The proportions are too tight, the form too specialized, the canopy too dominant. It lacks the visual cues that define automotive familiarity. No traditional doors, no wide stance, no shared cabin space. Instead, it presents itself as something closer to a capsule, compact, focused, and purpose-driven. One observer once described it in a way that feels almost exact. It looks like it belongs on a runway but ended up on a road. That sense of displacement is what makes it so fascinating. Because the Messerschmitt KR200 doesn't just challenge expectations, it ignores them entirely. What makes it insane? Aircraft-style cockpit and tandem seating. But the deeper reality goes further. The Messerschmitt KR200 represents what happens when a completely different engineering culture is applied to everyday transportation. It shows how design changes when efficiency replaces tradition. It demonstrates that mobility can be reimagined from entirely different starting points. It reveals that not all cars are born from automotive thinking. Some are adapted from something else entirely. And that's why it still feels so unusual today. Not because it's extreme, but because it was never really trying to be a car in the first place. It was trying to be something else that just happened to have wheels.
The Citroën DS didn't just arrive as a new model. It arrived like a shock to the entire idea of what a car was supposed to be. Because most cars evolve. The DS didn't evolve. It appeared. Unveiled by Citroën in the 1955 Paris Motor Show, it caused something close to disbelief. People didn't just admire it, they reacted to it. Crowds gathered, orders flooded in, and within hours it became clear that this wasn't simply another post-war design. It was a complete break from everything around it. At first glance, the Citroën DS looks almost fluid, as if it wasn't assembled but shaped by air itself. The body tapers, curves, and narrows in ways that ignore traditional automotive proportion. There are no rigid, upright surfaces, no clear separation between elements, just a continuous, flowing form. It doesn't look engineered, it looks sculpted. One observer at the time said something that still feels accurate. It doesn't look like it's built, it looks like it landed. That sense of otherworldliness is only the beginning. Because the real revolution of the Citroën DS isn't just visual, it's mechanical. The hydro-pneumatic suspension system is what transforms the car from unusual to almost unreal. Instead of conventional springs and dampers, the DS uses pressurized fluid and gas to control ride height and movement. The result isn't just comfort, it's a completely different relationship between the car and the road. It doesn't absorb bumps, it erases them. The car glides, floats, and settles in a way that feels disconnected from the surface beneath it. Road imperfections don't translate into sharp impacts. They become distant, muted sensations. One driver described it in a way that feels almost surreal. It feels like the road is optional. That's not exaggeration, because the suspension doesn't just smooth the ride, it actively maintains the car's level regardless of load or conditions. The body rises and lowers automatically, adjusting itself in real time. Even when parked, the car slowly settles, as if it's breathing. That alone would be enough to define it. But the Citroën DS goes further. The system that controls the suspension also integrates with braking, steering, and other functions. Instead of separate mechanical systems, the DS uses a centralized hydrologic, one network controlling multiple aspects of the car's behavior.
That level of integration was almost unheard of at the time, and it created behaviors that felt almost impossible. The most famous example is the ability to drive even after a tire failure. Because the suspension can compensate for height and balance, the car can remain controllable under conditions that would disable most vehicles. Not comfortably, but functionally. One engineer later explained it in simple terms: it doesn't collapse when something fails, it adapts. That adaptability is what made the DS feel less like a machine and more like a system. A system that responds, a system that maintains itself, a system that behaves differently depending on conditions. Even the controls reinforce this feeling. The brake pedal, for example, isn't a traditional pedal, it's more like a pressure-sensitive button. The steering is light, almost detached. Everything about the interaction feels slightly unfamiliar, as if the car is translating your inputs rather than directly executing them. That translation creates distance, not in a negative way, but in a transformative one. Because the Citroën DS doesn't just change how the car behaves, it changes how driving feels. You're not managing a collection of mechanical parts, you're interacting with a coordinated system. One longtime owner described it in a way that feels almost philosophical. You don't drive it like other cars, you learn how it wants to move. That idea of the car having its own logic is what makes the DS so different from its contemporaries. Most cars obey. The DS interprets. What makes it insane, technology and design decades ahead of its time. But even that doesn't fully capture it. Because the Citroën DS didn't just predict the future, it redefined the expectations of the present. It showed that comfort could be engineered, not just cushioned. It demonstrated that systems could replace mechanisms. It proved that a car could behave in ways that felt almost unnatural and still be entirely functional. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed that innovation doesn't always feel familiar when it arrives. Sometimes it feels strange, uncomfortable, even alien, until the rest of the world catches up. That's why the DS still feels so remarkable today. Not because it looks different, but because it changed the experience of driving at a level most cars never attempt. A machine that didn't just move people from place to place, but quietly redefined what movement itself could feel like.
The BMW Isetta is one of those machines that forces you to reconsider something you normally never question: what a car actually is. Because most cars, no matter how different they look, still follow the same underlying logic. You approach from the side, open a door, sit next to someone, face forward, and operate a machine that surrounds you with space, structure, and a certain sense of presence. The Isetta breaks that entire sequence. Not partially, completely. Originally conceived by ISO and later refined and produced by BMW, the car wasn't just a response to post-war economic conditions, it was a response to spatial limitations, material shortages, and a completely different understanding of mobility. The question it tries to answer isn't how do we build a better car, it's how little can we build and still call it one. That question defines everything about the BMW Isetta. The front entry door is the most obvious example, but its importance goes beyond novelty. When the entire nose of the vehicle swings open, bringing the steering wheel with it, it removes the idea of entering a car as a lateral movement. You don't slide into position, you step directly into the center of the machine. That creates a completely different spatial awareness. The car no longer feels like something you sit inside of from the side. It feels like something you enter from the front, almost like stepping into a capsule or a piece of equipment. One owner described that moment vividly. It doesn't feel like opening a car door, it feels like opening the whole car. That single design decision reshapes everything that follows. Inside, the proportions become almost surreal. The cabin is compact to the point where every surface feels close. There's no wasted space, no separation between driver and structure, no sense of excess volume. The curvature of the body wraps around the occupants, creating an environment that feels enclosed but not heavy. It's tight, but not oppressive, more like being contained within a protective shell. That's why the helmet comparison comes up so often.
It feels like driving inside a helmet, because the experience isn't about being surrounded by a car, it's about being enclosed within a small, defined volume that moves with you. The boundaries are always visible, always present, always close. And that proximity changes perception. Speed feels different, space feels different, distance feels different. Even modest movement feels amplified because there's so little between you and the outside world. The engine reinforces this sensation. Mounted at the rear, small and modest in output, it doesn't push the car forward with force, it nudges it along. But because the vehicle itself is so light, that nudge is enough. The relationship between power and weight is balanced in a way that doesn't rely on excess. It's not fast, but it doesn't feel completely slow either. It exists in its own scale. And that scale becomes most noticeable when the BMW Isetta is placed in a larger environment. Among full-sized cars, especially the wide, heavy, and powerful vehicles of the 1950s and 60s, it appears almost unreal. Not just smaller, but fundamentally different. It doesn't share the same visual language, it doesn't project the same presence, it doesn't even seem to belong to the same category. One driver once said something that captures that contrast perfectly. You feel like a pedestrian who happens to be moving faster. That's a striking observation, because it suggests that the Isetta doesn't elevate you into the commanding position that most cars provide. Instead, it keeps you closer to the scale of the environment, closer to the street, closer to the movement of people, closer to the idea of mobility as something lightweight and flexible rather than dominant and imposing. And that creates a completely different psychological experience. You're not controlling a large machine, you're participating in motion. Even the way the car interacts with space reflects this philosophy. Parking isn't a challenge, it's almost irrelevant. Maneuvering isn't about negotiating large dimensions, it's about fitting into places that larger cars simply cannot occupy. The BMW Isetta doesn't demand space, it finds it. And that ability changes how you think about urban movement entirely. One urban owner once summarized it simply: it doesn't fight the city, it works with it. That's something most cars struggle to achieve. Because most cars are designed with scale in mind, long distances, open roads, presence. The Isetta is designed with constraints in mind, tight streets, limited resources, efficiency above all else. And those constraints become its identity. What makes it insane? Front entry design and bubble-like proportions. But the deeper reality is far more revealing. The BMW Isetta isn't just unusual, it represents a completely different answer to the question of mobility. It shows that a car doesn't need size to function. It proves that complexity isn't required for usability. It demonstrates that the experience of movement can be redefined by changing scale alone. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that bigger is inherently better. Because the Isetta doesn't try to compete with larger cars, it sidesteps them entirely. It operates in a different dimension of design, one where efficiency replaces presence, where ingenuity replaces excess, and where the definition of a car becomes flexible rather than fixed. That's why it still feels so unusual today. Not because it's impractical, not because it's outdated, but because it belongs to a completely different philosophy, one that the automotive world explored briefly and then largely left behind. A machine that doesn't just look different, but quietly asks a question most cars never dare to ask. How small can mobility become before it stops feeling like a car at all? The GM Firebird I doesn't feel like a car that borrowed ideas from aviation. It feels like aviation accidentally touched the ground and decided to stay there for a moment. Because nothing about it follows automotive logic. Not the proportions, not the engine, not even the way you're supposed to sit inside it. Built by General Motors as part of its experimental Firebird program, this machine wasn't trying to improve the automobile. It was trying to redefine it by importing an entirely different technological language. And that language was jet propulsion. At a time when the world was obsessed with speed, altitude, and the promise of the jet age, the GM Firebird I took that fascination to its absolute extreme. Instead of a piston engine, it used a gas turbine, essentially the same type of power plant found in aircraft. That alone separates it from almost anything else ever built. Because a turbine doesn't behave like a traditional engine. It doesn't deliver power in the same way, doesn't respond with the same immediacy, and doesn't fit neatly into the expectations of road use. It's smoother in operation, capable of incredible speeds, but also far less practical in everyday conditions. Which immediately raises a question: why put something like that into a car? The answer is simple: because they could. The GM Firebird I wasn't trying for practicality, it was about possibility. Visually, that intent is unmistakable. The body of the GM Firebird I doesn't resemble a car in any conventional sense. It's long, narrow, and sharply pointed, with wings and fins that echo aircraft design rather than automotive styling. There's no attempt to disguise the influence. It embraces it completely. The central cockpit reinforces this idea even further. Instead of a traditional cabin with multiple seats, the driver sits alone, positioned in the middle like a pilot. The layout is focused, isolated, and entirely directional, everything aligned toward forward motion. You don't share the space, you command it. One observer described the experience in a way that feels almost literal. It doesn't feel like driving, it feels like preparing for takeoff. That's not just a metaphor, because the GM Firebird I was never meant to operate within the normal expectations of road vehicles. It wasn't designed for traffic, for comfort, or for everyday usability. It was designed to explore the outer limits of what a ground-based vehicle could be if freed from conventional constraints. And when those constraints are removed, design becomes something else entirely. The proportions stretch beyond practicality. The structure prioritizes vision over usability. The entire machine becomes an experiment rather than a solution. Even standing still, the Firebird I looks like it's moving too fast for its environment. The long nose, the swept surfaces, the narrow body all suggest speed at a level that roads themselves struggle to accommodate. It looks like it belongs somewhere else. A runway, a test facility, an imagined future where cars behave more like aircraft than automobiles. One historian captured that displacement perfectly. It looks like it missed its turn and ended up on the wrong kind of surface. And that's exactly what makes it so compelling. Because the Firebird I doesn't just blur categories, it ignores them. It doesn't ask whether it's a car or a plane. It simply exists as something that contains elements of both without fully committing to either. And that creates a strange kind of identity. It's not practical enough to be a car, not capable of flight to be an aircraft, but too advanced, too ambitious to be dismissed as either. It occupies a conceptual space rather than a functional one. What makes it insane is a jet-powered car that looks like it should be on a runway, not a highway. But the deeper reality is even more revealing. The GM Firebird I represents a moment when imagination briefly outran context, when designers and engineers looked at emerging technology, notably jet propulsion, and asked not how do we apply this carefully, but how far can we push this before it breaks the idea of a car entirely? And the answer in this case was very far. It shows that innovation doesn't always move in straight lines. It demonstrates that some ideas are explored not because they will succeed, but because they expand the boundaries of what's possible. And it reveals that sometimes the most important machines are the ones that don't fit anywhere, because they redefine the edges of every category they touch. That's why the Firebird I still feels so unreal today. Not because it failed, but because it wasn't trying to succeed in the way normal cars do. It was trying to ask a different question altogether. What happens when you stop designing cars and start designing speed itself?